we're very fortunate, and thank you. I know that Steve puts a lot of time into these. I do want to thank you, Steve, for all of the time that you put to organize it and create a PowerPoint that really can talk to us, and that if you have questions, the PowerPoint itself has information that we can go back to those pictures. Maybe these are places that you wanted to go to or places that you've been to, and you can relive it through the pictures that Steve Mirer is sharing. So I'm just going to share a little bit about today's, and then we'll spotlight Steve and give him the floor. So Steve and his wife went on a cruise down under with port visits in New Zealand, Australia, and French Polynesia. And highlights of that trip, and I know Steve will share these, but this is just some of the things that will be shared, is watching harness sky jumpers descend from the top of the Sky Tower in Auckland, New Zealand, attending an opera at the Sydney Opera House, petting a koala in Adelaide, snorkeling on the Great Barrier Reef, swimming with sharks and rays in the waters of Bora Bora. So these are some of the pictures that you'll see from Steve today. And I'm going to spotlight Steve. Steve, thank you again.
Okay, it's my pleasure. So I'm going into slideshow. Can you see me?
I see you. Well, first, share your screen again, because I stopped the share.
Oh.
So if I...
Okay.
There you go.
All right.
And now you go into slideshow. Perfect.
All right. One of my goals when I retired was to travel around Australia for 2 months. This is a map of Australia. Our cruise actually started in New Zealand. We then sailed to Sydney in Australia, cruised around clockwise until we got to about here, then took a diversion off to Indonesia for a few days, then continued around Australia, back to Sydney, then off to French Polynesia. And the cruise actually went and then to Hawaii, but that's well beyond the scope of today. So my dream came true in January of 2012 when we took our first celebrity cruise on the Century, which was actually 3 back-to-back cruises for a total of 54 days. We started the trip by flying to Auckland on the North Island of New Zealand, arriving in the morning. Since it was too early to board the ship, Celebrity arranged an unexpected day of sightseeing, which started with a trip to the Auckland Savage Memorial, a mausoleum and obelisk for former Prime Minister Michael Joseph Savage. The site contained a park with a memorial garden and a reflecting pool with views of the city across the bay. The next stop was the Auckland War Memorial Museum, which had collections on the history of the region, natural history, and military history. The last stop of the day was the Sky Tower, an observation and communication tower. From the observation deck, we had great views of the harbor and city and of harnessed guide cable controlled jumpers using the sky jump to plunge 630 feet from the observation deck to the ground. From there, we were taken to the ship to begin our journey. The first port of call was Tauranga, New Zealand. Before we left the ship, we arranged tours on our own for some of the ports rather than take excursions sold by the cruise line. At the Tauranga Wharf, which provided great views of the harbor with people fishing from the pier, we shared a Ford stretch limo with another couple, with champagne included. We traveled to the Akari Falls, which flows into the Katuma River, Tikatapu, Blue Lake, and Lake Tarawera. So first, this is a view of Auckland. This is actually the Sky Tower. This is the Auckland War Memorial Museum. World War II heavily impacted New Zealand and Australia, so a lot of the cities had war memorials. similar to the Soviet Union. This is a view when we were on top of the sky tower of the harbor in Auckland. And this is a view out the window of somebody on his way down the 630 feet to the ground. Something we didn't decide to do. This is the Tauranga Wharf. And this is Tauranga Lake, Tarawera. The next stop was the Rokatua Tipua village, where we saw a memorial cultural performance with an authentic Maori village with geothermal springs and crafts such as weaving and wood carving. From there, we proceeded to the Rokatua Agrodome, where we saw farm animals, including ostrich, and then to the Rokatua Ohamutu, another Maori village. The last stop of the day was the Tauranga Hurana Springs Reserve, where we toured picturesque springs with ducks bordered by lush vegetation. So this is the Tipua village, where we were treated to a genuine Maori cultural show. And this is the village, or sites around the village. This is the village. This is the agrodome. These are ostriches. They're very fierce animals, actually. You don't want to get too close to an ostrich. This is Ohinamutu. This is the Hamorana Springs Reserve. Overnight, we traveled to the South Island of New Zealand, and the next day we had a private tour, starting with a visit to a sheep ranch in Akaroa. On the way, we drove through Christchurch, which had been severely damaged by an earthquake the year before. We saw a lot of buildings that were blocked off for repairs. At the sheep ranch, the rancher showed us his flock and had his dog demonstrate his sheep herding skills. He then took us to his barn where he sheared a sheep for our viewing pleasure and provided us with tea and biscuits. We then headed back to the ship, passing the rocky, hilly landscape of Akaroa with its scrub of vegetation and lakes. So this is Christchurch, and you can see scaffolding where buildings are. This is to hold it up and then at some point rebuild. This is the sheep ranch with some of the flock. This is the farmer shearing the sheep. And this is our tea and biscuits with the farmer. And this is a view of Akaroa. The last port we visited in New Zealand was Dunedin, which possessed the world's steepest street. Riding down Baldwin Street is like being on a roller coaster. After seeing the downtown area, we headed for Larnach Castle, where we toured the mansion. This was followed by a drive through the countryside, where we saw sheep in a pen and a lake with swans and other birds on our way to Penguin Place, a conservation project to encourage the breeding of yellow-eyed penguins. We saw a number of penguins in their huts and nests. Next up was the Royal Albatross Observatory, where we viewed a northern Royal Albatross breeding colony. We saw Royal Albatross with a wingspan of almost 10 feet, silently and effortlessly gliding past. Back in the city of Dunedin, we visited Sprite's Brewery, where we sampled their beer. So this is downtown Dunedin. This is the very steep street. You can't really appreciate how steep it was, but up here is like the top of the roller coaster. This is Larnock Castle, which was a mansion. A lot of birds. This is Penguin Place, where the penguins hung out in these breeding huts. This is at the Royal Albatross Observatory. This is Sprite's Brewery. These are some of the casks that the beer is stored in. This is the train station. And more train station. The next day we sailed through Fiordland National Park, passing by the fjords of Dusky Sound, Doubtful Sound, and Milford Sound. The sound separates New Zealand from Australia. Since it was a cloudy day, visibility into the sounds was not good. At Milford Sound, we saw a number of waterfalls pouring water into the sound. So this is Dusky Sound. This is Milford Sound. When we left New Zealand territorial waters and spent the next 2 days sailing to Australia, it was fortuitous having sea days at this juncture because Super Bowl 46 between the New York Giants and the New England Patriots was being played in the US. The televised game was shown on a huge screen in the ship's theater, and appropriate football fare was served for lunch. Most of the Aussies and Kiwis on board didn't care about the game, but I certainly enjoyed it. That's because the Giants beat New England for the second Super Bowl in 4 years. The first port in Australia was Sydney, where we spent 2 days. There was only one cruise ship dock at the harbor, which was occupied, so we had to anchor offshore and take a tender to shore. The two major attractions in the harbor area were the Harbor Bridge and the Opera House. Views around the harbor area and the city skyline were great. A popular activity for the brave was to climb to the top of Harbor Bridge. Groups were provided with jumpsuits and were harnessed together for the climb. Needless to say, we passed on the opportunity. Instead, we opted to attend an opera, The Magic Flute, performed in English at the Opera House. So this is a view from the harbor of the Opera House. This is Harbor Bridge. These are some of the lucky climbers. You can see that, well, you can't really see, but they each have a jumpsuit and they're linked together. So if one falls, they all go. This is, these are actually ferry boats that cruise around the harbor. More harbor. The second day, we took a train to Katoomba to visit the Aboriginal Center, where we viewed a dance and didgeridoo performance by Aboriginal men in traditional paint and costume. The main purpose of the excursion was to see the Three Sisters rock formation, which could be viewed from Echo Point. However, it was raining and visibility was obscured, so we weren't able to do so. Instead, we returned to the cruise ship. But this is what the Three Sisters in the Blue Mountains looks like. I purloined this picture from the internet. The next stop was Melbourne, where we were met by a friend of Arlene's from India, now living in Melbourne. He took us on a tour of the city, starting with the Queen Victoria Market, which contained more than 1,000 stalls selling everything from fruit and vegetables to delicatessen products and cheeses. We had a view of skyscrapers from the waterfront and Victorian buildings mixed with new high-rise blocks in the city. We also took a trolley car ride around the downtown area and had lunch at an Indian restaurant in the suburbs. That evening, before the ship left for the next port, we saw an online Aboriginal dance and didgeridoo performance. So this is Melbourne skyline. This is the Parliament. More Melbourne. This is Arlene at the Queen Victoria Market, where you could buy fruits and vegetables and everything you need for your house. Two days later, we arrived in Adelaide, where we journeyed to the Cleland Conservation Park, which featured animals that we don't see back home, such as kangaroos, wombats, bandicoots, echidnas, and koalas. We were able to pet a koala in a tree and have our picture taken next to it. Kangaroos of all sizes hopping around were in abundance. The next stop was Mount Lofty, which offered spectacular views of the surrounding countryside and the city. We finished the day with a visit to the South Australian Museum, which had a collection of artifacts that recounted the history and culture of Australia. So this is a koala, and this is a kangaroo. This is a lady with her groupies. This is what an echidna looks like. It's like a porcupine. This is the view from Mount Lofty and street scenes of Adelaide. Another 2 days of cruising took us to Albany, where we just walked around to check out the part of town closest to the port. We saw the old Gold colonial prison, the town hall, Wesley Church, and some cottages and surrounding gardens belonging to early settlers. We also saw the replica of the brig Amity, the original having conveyed the first English settlers to Western Australia. The next port was Bunbury, where we took a bus to the city of Busselton to see the Busselton Jetty, extending out into the Indian Ocean with views of the beach. We took the tourist train ride to the end of the jetty and back, and then the bus back to Bunbury. So this is the town of Albany, the church, the prison. And this is Bunbury. Then this is Bustleton Beach. And this is the train that we took along the jetty. The next port was Fremantle, about 12 miles from the city of Perth. This was the last stop on the first leg of our trip. Our cruise was actually 3 back-to-back 18-day cruises. Arlene had made friends with an Indian couple on the cruise who lived in Perth, and they drove us into Perth and spent part of the day showing us the sights. The first stop was Kings Park with its views of Perth and of the Swan River. We also went to a park containing a war memorial and to St. Mary's Church. After our host returned us to Fremantle, where the cruise ship was docked, we went to the Fremantle Market, which sold handicrafts, specialty foods, fish, and vegetables. The city has a lot of attractive Victorian era architecture, and we saw the technical school, post office, and railway station. We also visited an instrument store where two young lady customers were getting a lesson in playing the didgeridoo. We then boarded the Celebrity to begin the second leg of our journey, sailing overnight to Geraldton. This is the view of Perth. That's actually the cruise ship Celebrity out in the harbor. This is the view of Kings Park. This is a war memorial. The church. This is in Fremantle. That's the post office. The train station. The school. And these are the ladies getting a didgeridoo lesson. This is actually a guy, I think. As we docked in Geraldton, we could see hundreds of new cars on the dock waiting to be delivered to dealers. There were also picturesque views of boats in the harbor floating on the turquoise blue waters of the Indian Ocean. The major attraction in the city was the HMAS Sydney 2 Memorial, dedicated to the men lost when their ship was sunk by a German ship during World War II. So this is the dock at Geraldton with all the cars waiting to be delivered. This is the War Memorial. This is underneath the memorial. This is Geraldton. Two days later, we arrived in Broome, where we saw a number of Aboriginal people, the indigenous Australians. The ones that we saw were poorly dressed, mostly sitting around on the ground or stoops. We visited a store and saw some men buying cases of beer. Cable Beach had beautiful white sand, and from there we took a bus to the Japanese cemetery, where many of the Japanese who had come to Australia to dive for pearls and mother of pearl, the luminous inside of oyster shells, were buried. Back on board the ship, we witnessed a magnificent sunset. So this is Aboriginal people in Broome. the guy stocking up for the weekend. I think this is just for tourists, these camels. This is Cable Beach. This is the Japanese cemetery. And this is the magnificent sunset. The next day, we deviated from circumventing the Australian coast. Now, at this point, we had gone from Sydney to about here, and we spent a couple of days going up to Indonesia before we came back to Australia, to the port of Darwin. We continued around back to Sydney, and from Sydney to French Polynesia, and then on to Hawaii. So the diversion to Indonesia took us to the port of Benoa on the island of Bali, part of Indonesia, but that adventure I'll cover next month. It took 2 days to get to Darwin in northern Australia, where we walked around the city, enjoying the views and shopping for treasures to bring home. So this is Darwin. This is some of the Aboriginal painting. We actually brought back a couple of pieces. It took 3 days to sail to Cairns on the Great Barrier Reef, anchoring at Yorkeys Knob, where we had to use tenders to get to shore. We began our tour by snorkeling from a beach using wetsuits and snorkeling gear provided by the tour company. Unfortunately, I couldn't see much because I had to take my glasses off to use the mask. I don't think there was much to see because there was no coral in the vicinity. Next, we took a trip in a half submersible vessel where we could see swimming by and the coral reef from the side windows. This was followed by a trip in a glass bottom boat where we saw much the same thing. I couldn't get very good photos because of the reflection from the glass and the distortion of the water. As we left the boat, we saw a school of porpoises frolicking in the water. So this is Cairns. It's actually a seaplane. So these are some of the pictures I took from either the make-believe submarine or from the glass bottom boat. These, I think, are porpoises. The trip to Brisbane took 3 days. Whenever we had sea days, I would go to the gym to work out and read books. Harleen would play mahjong or bridge and attend art auctions. We both would go to lectures given during the day and in the evening to the onboard shows. Arriving in Brisbane, we took a trip to the Australia Zoo, made famous by the late Steve Irwin, whose wildlife documentary series, The Crocodile Hunter, made the zoo a popular tourist attraction. On the way, we stopped for lunch at the original Ethamoga pub, which was based on a magazine cartoon and had become a chain of pubs throughout Australia. The timber building featured sloping walls and a distinctive architectural style true to the original cartoon design. The Australia Zoo featured a wide variety of birds, mammals, and reptiles. We saw keepers with koalas and pythons promoting hands-on animal encounters. a crocodile show, and an elephant feeding. This is Brisbane. McDonald's is all over the world. This is the pub, the Etamoga pub. This is at the Australia Zoo. These are crocodiles. This is a cassowary. Koala. An iguana. And a python. Kangaroo. The last stop on this leg of the cruise was the return to Sydney, where this time we got to dock at the pier. Walking down the gangplank brought us right into the city, where we saw, among other sights, Aboriginal street performers playing didgeridoos. At this point, a lot of the Australians who had been on the first two legs of the cruise departed. Since we were continuing on the cruise, Arlene and I had a day to further explore Sydney. We took a harbor ferry cruise, which gave us different views of the Sydney skyline, the Opera House, and the Harbor Bridge. So this is a ferry boat passing the Opera House. This is more Harbor Bridge in the harbor. This is our cruise ship, the Celebrity Century. A guy enjoying his beer. Across the harbor was this amusement park, Luna Park. And these are some school kids waiting to go on a cruise of the harbor. Next stop was the Queen Victoria building, which had 4 shopping floors and featured the Great Australian Clock and stained glass windows. While Arlene went shopping, I also visited the Jewish Museum and walked around the Rocks, Australia's first permanent European settlement, which contained many unique historic buildings. We met back on board to begin the third leg of the journey, which was French Polynesia and Hawaii. This is Chinatown. This is the Queen Victoria building. This is a very famous clock. Not quite as famous as Big Ben, but it's up there. It had beautiful stained glass windows. These are some Aboriginal playing the didgeridoo and another instrument. This is the Rocks. That's the original European settlement. 6 days of sailing from Australia got us to Papeete, the capital of Tahiti in French Polynesia, where we were greeted by local musicians and ladies selling tours of the island. So the French Polynesia is made up of a number of groups of islands. We made stops in the Society Islands at some of these, Bora Bora, Raiatea, Maria, and Papit, the 4 stops. We passed colorful markets selling produce and household goods, and women making flower leaves in booths on the street. The first stop on our tour was Point Venus, a peninsula on the north coast, where we saw rocky beaches with pontoon fishing boats and a white lighthouse dating back to 1868. We passed the Arahoho blowhole overlooking a black sand beach, where incoming waves caused water to shoot out of a hole in the rocks on the far side of the road. So these are views of Papit in Tahiti. Some of the locals entertaining us. These ladies were actually selling tours. This is the downtown area. This is an indoor market where you could buy just about everything. Hat shop. These ladies were making the lace. Point Venus. And this is the blowhole. You can see the water going through the rocks and exploding. We then visited the Paul Gauguin Museum, a Japanese-styled art museum which contained original Gauguin documents, photographs, reproductions, sculptures, engravings, and gouaches. Next, we toured the Vapahi Gardens, which contained over 75 different species of vegetation, all kept fresh by water from Lake Vahiria in the center of the island. Our last stop was the restored Arahua Mare, an ancient temple or meeting place that was maintained like a museum. It contained ancient Polynesian temples and meeting places and had exhibit boards to explain the significance of each part. Back on board the ship, before we set sail, we saw a performance by native dancers in colorful costumes. So this is the Gauguin Museum. This is the Vapahi Gardens. This is the marae. It's a religious site for natives. I think these are dedications to ancestors. And this is the onboard native performance. The next island in our travels was Moorea, where we hired a taxi for a trip along the main coastal road, which circled the island. We saw lush vegetation, rocky beaches, pineapple plantations, and thatched resort huts built on stilts over the water next to sandy beaches. We visited a resort which featured over-the-water bungalows with glass paneled floors to allow viewing of fish swimming below the hut. This resort also had a pool where guests could swim with a dolphin. We also journeyed to the Belvedere Lookout Point, where we had views of Cook's Bay and Opunhu Bay. Unfortunately, it was cloudy and foggy, so we couldn't fully appreciate the beauty of the view. Returning to the ship, we were treated to a beautiful sunset framing dark clouds. So this is Maria. This is the kind of housing people lived in. It's a church. These are resort huts built on stilts, and each of these rooms had glass bottom floors, so you can see the marine vegetation. As you can see, it was cloudy. The banyan tree, the roots spread out in a very large area, a lot of hanging down vines. This is a closer view of the resort huts. And the sunset. At Bora Bora, we took a boat out to one of the barrier coral reefs, which surrounded the island, to go snorkeling in an area inhabited by small sharks and rays, which were oblivious to our presence. The lens of the mask that I used magnified things, so I was able to see multicolored fish swimming by, which the guide on our boat attracted by throwing food into the water. I had such a good time that I didn't notice that I was getting sunburned until it was too late. When the group got done snorkeling, the boat guide played the ukulele and sang songs for our entertainment. The views from the boat were of thatched roofed over the water bungalows and beautiful blue water, which changed shades depending upon how the light was reflected. Oh, this is Bora Bora. And these are some of the people enjoying the water. And these are the sharks that we were enjoying the water with, and the stingray. There's our ukulele playing boat skipper. On the way back to the port, we stopped at Bloody Mary's restaurant for lunch and an exotic tropical drink. Outside the restaurant was a huge sign with the names of all the celebrities that had eaten there. At the port, there were women selling food and handicrafts and fresh coconut drinks. On board, the ship had a farewell cocktail party on deck as we sailed away. The sunset was the best one of the trip, which had many fabulous sunsets. So this is the happy couple at Bloody Mary's. This is a tourist bus.
Bloody Mary is from South Pacific, by the way.
The song was from South Pacific. I don't know about the restaurant.
I'm saying that's where Bloody Mary came from.
Okay, yes, true. And that's the best sunset of the cruise. The last stop in French Polynesia was Raiatea, where we visited a vanilla plantation in which we saw vanilla vines growing up existing trees or poles, and were invited into the store to buy vanilla products. From there, we went to a pearl farm and learned how cultured pearls were produced. A piece of tissue from an oyster was implanted in a second oyster, which was then put back into the ocean for several years to allow the nucleus to be coated in many layers of nacre to produce the pearl. The farmer had to keep track of where he placed the oysters in the ocean. So this is Raiatea. It's actually pronounced Raiatea. The vanilla plantation. This is the pearl farm that we visited. And you can see where some of the oysters have been put back in to grow the pearls. This is a marae, which again is a religious site for the Aboriginal people. We next stop at the marae at Taputei, an ancient Polynesian temple. We finished the day in the town of Yotoroa, visiting the market and harbor, where we walked around before boarding our ship, which departed for Hawaii, which will also have to be part of a separate presentation. So this is the marae. These women were selling fruit. This is a market. Raiatea Harbor. These again are huts with glass bottom floors. And now we're leaving Raiatea on our way to Hawaii. And that concludes the presentation.
Those are great pictures. Did you stay in any of those bottomless huts?
No, we stayed on our bottomless cruise ship.
They're
The
called
bottomless cruise-
overwater bungalows. That's what we call them in the industry, overwater bungalows. And they have glass floors and the fish swim under your floor.
Yeah, I got a message today from a person who's all about American Express points and conversions, that you can now stay in one of those in Bora Bora for 27,000 American Express points.
Very, very expensive.
What's that worth in dollars?
I have no clue, but he was saying it's a big deal. It's a big steal because it's not for a day. Basically, you transfer your American Express points into Hilton points, whatever. I'm not doing it. I just saw it as a.
Very, very expensive.
I'll tell you, actually, I'll find out for you. Any questions for Steve? or a picture you want to go back? Don't be shy. Ellen, you have a question?
You're muted, Ellen.
Okay. We were in Sydney also. When you went to the synagogue, were they still having that light show as he explained the synagogue?
I never claimed to go to the synagogue, so I can't answer the question.
Oh, all right. Okay. They also had a very nice Polynesian history museum about the Aborigines.
Sydney was a very nice city. If I had to live in Australia, I would like to live there.
Ellen, that's where we went to the show. We went to see the Aboriginal art, and they had a program at the museum that we went to. He went to the Jewish Museum, right, Steve, in Sydney?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Okay, just curious.
So I left people speechless, huh?
No, I'm looking for your. I'm looking for that Hilton thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Here we go. No. I should probably search on the site and figure it out.
I actually put a message in the chat, Steve, not to get political, but I heard more than a couple people say that if Trump got in again, they were going to move to New Zealand. And I was wondering, I guess their political system is good, but I was wondering what your take on that was.
About them moving to New Zealand, or what I thought of New Zealand. What was the question?
Well, actually, Judy, you muted yourself afterwards.
Why was New Zealand a good place to live?
Oh, who said it wasn't a good place? If you like sheep farming, it's great. If you like rugged scenery for hiking and stuff, that's a great place to go.
Ellen, I said upstate New York, where we lived in the Adirondacks, was just as beautiful as New Zealand. Everybody talked about how beautiful it was, and it was just beautiful places with sheep, but upstate New York is just as beautiful. Rabbi, I looked it up. It's $430 is a bargain to stay in one of those. That's a low end price.
No, I just looked at this website. I could share it afterwards. He wrote that the Maldives, at the Conrad Maldives, it's $1,500 to $3,500 after tax per night.
They started
after the private pool.
Yeah, they started $430.
Anyways,
New Zealand became popular after Lord of the Rings movies because it was filmed there. The trilogy was filmed there.
I was thinking that maybe the political system was the drawing card.
Okay, that I don't know.
Okay.
We're non-political.
I'll go political after we go off Facebook. I'm just joking. Question: what was your favorite part of that entire cruise?
Coming home alive.
Why? Why was there?
I'm kidding. It's hard to say. The cruise was great. When we started out, I didn't know how we would survive 54 days on the boat, and then we spent some days in Hawaii afterwards. But after a few weeks, we became friends with the crew on the boat. It was like family, and it was fine.
I wasn't very impressed with Australia because it was all cities. I like to see people living like in Indonesia, where I had been before we went together. I like to see people living on the land, and all of Australia was cities. So I'm not a city person, even though I was born in a city. So I liked, of course, the Bora Bora and Mirer are just absolutely gorgeous. They're just unbelievable.
Again, this was a 54-day cruise, correct?
It was 3 18-day cruises back to back.
Got you. Okay, so you're saying each country, kind of like Australia was an 18-day cruise, New Zealand was an 18-day cruise?
Well, I kind of indicated in my text, but you kind of get lost in that. So the first leg started in New Zealand, and it went partially away around the west coast of Australia. The second leg went from that port back to Sydney. That was the second leg. And that also included going off to Indonesia for a few days. And the third leg went from Sydney to French Polynesia and Hawaii. And we didn't know about it before, but there was a fourth leg that went from Hawaii to San Diego. But 54 days was more than enough. And we actually, a few years later, did the
Last leg.
cruise from San Diego to Hawaii. So in our lifetime accomplishment, we got that done too.
Nice.
We're supposed to go on a 40-day cruise in December. Who knows? I don't know if we can handle it, but we're going to try if we can get on it.
But we're seasoned. We did 54 days already.
Do they market this as a 54-day trip? Meaning, do they also sell it as a group, or it's like each one separately and you just knew it was the same?
No,
boat?
you got to figure it out. You get a brochure and
No.
well, okay, you're the professional.
I'll tell you what happened. We wanted to do Australia and New Zealand at the same time. And it's a very expensive venture to do it together. I mean, you're talking between $20,000 and $30,000 to do it. So this was the least expensive way to do the most of it. The only thing we had to miss was going to Ayers Rock, which was the outback. And I saw enough drunken Aborigines and Aborigines on the trip. So that was the only thing we didn't go. The outback is very rural, but there's not much to see. So that was the least expensive way to do all of it.
For the Outback, we had the movie that we shared, the Jewish Outback.
Yeah.
The rabbis.
Yeah.
Arlene passed on that one, I think.
You did? Oh. Well, that would have been your to see all the good
part of it.
people. Shelley, you have a question?
Well, I have to leave. I have another meeting starting at 1:30, but Judy was, really wanting her question answered, and I think I have the answer for her.
Sure.
When the very minute that like one case was found in New Zealand of COVID, they shut the island down, and they got no cases. Nobody had any problems. They were shut down for a long time, but everybody managed just fine to be within their island and keep COVID away. So I think that's where the name New Zealand came up as a good place to live. If the political, it wasn't just about politics. It was the fact that they were the safest, best off country in the world.
Well, we had friends who said they were going back to England if Trump got in again, and he was from England.